warm welcome to all of you on this Navigating Patriarchy on Movement, Migration and Displacement panel. I want to welcome Myriam and Annie, who we've got on the panel today, along with Sabyn, Javeri, who will be joining us in just a few moments. And I guess I want to start with just a huge shout out and acknowledgement to Ananke for trailblazing this entire festival, which is in its second year running. And what a staggering lineup we've had last year and this year. So I have to say, I'm particularly biased towards the conversation we're about to have right now. And very, very excited about, the subject, the themes we're planning to explore, but also just who we have on the panel. I'm going to keep the introductions fairly brief because I think Myriam and Annie should really reveal more about their identities, their politics, and their work through the conversation. But just a little bit on them before we get in. So we've got Myriam Tadesse with us. Myriam is an Ethiopian-born Paris-based writer. And there's so much that I could touch upon, but to try and keep it succinct, I'm going to say her memoir, Blind Spot, came out, and it explores the realities of being a biracial French citizen. She's also studied theater, philosophy, dance, music, and internal martial arts, which I'm so excited to chat to her about, amongst other things. And something that really struck me, Myriam, when I was going through your work quiz and your bio was that, I think in your role as an actress and a stage director, you've taught theater and dance to children and adults who haven't had access to it. And, what a great way of paying it forward, but also just doing something that's obviously close to your heart. Myriam also writes and directs documentaries, and we're going to get much more into her work as we move along. Next, we have with us Annie Zaidi. Annie is the author of multiple books, including City of Incident, Prelude to a Riot, as well as Bread, Cement, Cactus, a memoir of belonging and dislocation. Annie also received the really prestigious Tata Literature Live Award for her fiction work in 2020. And her writing has appeared vastly in several anthologies and journals, including the Griffiths Review, the Aleph Review, the Massachusetts Review, the Missing Slate, amongst many other notables. And one thing that I want to say about Annie, just before we delve into the heart of the conversation, I've obviously been engaging with all the panelists' work, in the lead up to the festival. But something that I can't go without saying is the documentary, because Annie has written and directed several short films, but in particular, her documentary film, In Her Words, The Journey of Indian Women. I've been exposed to it over the last few days. And let me just say for now, before we talk about it in more detail, it is just such a seminal narrative on this subject. And it's something that has really stayed with me. And I feel like I'll be introducing my students at NYU to it very, very soon. So something I want to get into, Annie, very soon. But welcome, ladies. Welcome to the Ananke Women in Literature Festival.
Thank you.
Annie, I think you're on mute.
I was just saying thank you so much for that wonderful introduction.
Of course, and I want to jump right in. So Myriam, maybe I'll start with you. In no way to put you on the spot, but one has to pick someone. I'm going to start with really stripping us back to the basics, I suppose, keeping the theme of the panel in mind. I want to talk about home, and I want to talk about home because it just, to me, seems like such a messy, kind of difficult to pin down and often very triggering word, And if Sabyn was here, she would probably vouch for it, but I'm sure it's the same for Annie and you as well, that living in Abu Dhabi, I faced this so much, where you get asked, where are you from? And you say, well, XYZ, and someone's like, no, but where are you really from? And that kind of throws me off to say, I'm not sure, So let's start, Myriam, there to say, what does home mean to you? What does it emotionally evoke? And I suppose, what kind of conversations does home encapsulate and symbolize for you? I know it's large, so make what you will of it, but let's start there.
Yes, it's very large, and I think home is is moving all the time, in fact, because home is linked to the sense of belonging, which is part of our theme. And you know, just thinking about it, I was wondering, yeah, but what is the sense of belonging? I mean, what is it related to? So is it, you know, there was one time where I was projecting this home in a place, a fixed place, somewhere outside. Then you come to this understanding that home is an inner place, in fact, and there's no home outside. And, you know, since you're looking for this home, yeah, outside of your inner place, then you just feel lost, in fact. And so home is still, is what keeps me moving, I would say, you know, now. So, and it has to do also with time, because the place where I could say it's home at one moment doesn't fit anymore. It's always changing. And I think in fact, home is a quest. It's the quest of what am I really related to? And it's also a kind of nostalgia for this unknown, that something in us knows that we're coming from, and so just keep the mystery of it, you know, and live with it and dance with it. That's what I could say.
I absolutely love that, Myriam, and so much in there that is, I'm sure, close to all of our hearts. I want to come back to talk about nostalgia for sure. I think that's the conversation on movement, migration. It's hard to disentangle that from nostalgia. But also, I think you give us vocabulary and tools to think about something which is so elusive, and kind of by acknowledging that enigma that's attached to it and kind of embracing that, as opposed to saying, I need to pin this down and anchor it into something geographical, which could be part of it. But I think what you said about looking within really moved me, you know, this idea of like the inner as opposed to always, because admittedly, immediately there's this sense of, is it Abu Dhabi? Is it Paris? Is it Ethiopia? Is it London? Is it Pakistan? Whatever the works, you know, and that's really poetically put. Thank you. And I know that's a big question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely words that I'm going to be borrowing from you as we move along. Annie, you know, as I was saying in the introduction, I have been so consumed by your work these last few days, by your writing, by your filmmaking, and I feel like I'm not sure I've processed all of it, because as I was saying earlier, I feel like it's been insufficient time for me, and I want to come back to it. I want to, you know, explore it in more gravitas. But even at this point, with the amount of interaction I've had with it, I want to start off by saying that it's incredibly evocative and powerful, and just right off the bat. And I think intuitive immediate reactions say something. And I want to start with something that I was reading written about you and your work. I think perhaps it was in The Guardian. And I want to use that as a springboard then to talk about, you know, what you write about and kind of the narratives you engage with. And it said something, I think I was reading somewhere that you self-identify as one of the lucky 5% financially independent women who can choose to marry. And I think the piece went on to say about you, but she writes that even for her, the biggest emotional negotiations continue to reflect an enduring ambivalence about female autonomy, so that as Zaidi works through successive pathways of her potential belonging, what she finds instead is a sequence of dead ends, a national project persistently hostile, often violently so, to every aspect of her identity as a successful, unmarried Muslim Indian woman. I mean, I want to break this down with you a little bit, and I want you to talk to us about this feeling of arriving at dead ends, and of dispossession. If I'm not mistaken, you speak about your own, but also touch upon your mother's. And also what it means to weave kind of something personal into political analysis, as you have done in Bread, Cement, Cactus, and other works of yours. But really, I think I want to start there and talk about this sense when you bump up against dead ends and when you think about autonomy in kind of that context.
Thank you, Saba. My training is as a journalist, and I think one thing that has taught me is to kind of not foreground the self too much. And it has also taught me to look for patterns and to look at what's happening in society as a whole. So when I set about writing my memoir, Bread, Cement, Cactus, I mean, it's positioned as a memoir, but it was always clear to me that it's not just about me. It's about what's happening to people like me. Initially, I thought that I wouldn't write about women. I wasn't thinking of women when I started to kind of approach the book. I made a list of chapters, etc. So I was thinking of displacement that occurs on account of industry, that occurs, the environmental kind of displacement. I was thinking of linguistic displacement, like sometimes your language is violently taken away, or you find yourself in a new place and how language kind of dispossesses you in that case, or you're discriminated against on account of faith or color or race, and all those things I was thinking about. But whenever I discussed the question of belonging or dislocation with women, I found that they would turn around and say things like, but as a woman, what does it even mean? And then I started thinking about it. And I have written about me being part of that very small minority before too. The way I break it down in percentage terms is because, and that figure may have changed now. I was using old data to kind of think about this. But if you look at the number of women who have postgraduate education, who study a little bit more beyond the basic BA or, BSc or whatever, I am one of those women. I also used my education to make money for myself and my family. So again, I am a little bit more independent. And because I was not married, particularly I was not married very young, I think that makes a big difference in women's lives. But my money is my own. I may choose to give it to my parents. I may choose to do whatever I want with it, but it is ultimately my money. It's understood that this is my money, and that neither my father nor my husband nor some kind of paternalistic figure controls my finances. And I think that does place me, I think I must be less than 5% actually, that very few women have not only financial freedom, but have emotional, social, familial independence. Within a family, do you have the kind of freedom that allows you to use your own money, to use your skills, not only for personal development, but to do what you like with your money, make those decisions. And I think reaching the dead end, in my sense, I haven't reached a dead end, although the reviewer does say this, but in a sense, I haven't reached a dead end. And I think part of that is on account of my specific family. I won't even say society. Family makes such a huge difference in the terms of what they allow you to do or not. I mean, technically when you're 21, family really should have no say in what you do or don't do. But in South Asia particularly, I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world. My experience of life is limited in that way, but where I come from, most certainly, the idea is that as a woman, lifelong you answer to someone. And this idea is reinforced very often violently. This is correct, that the reinforcing of control over your lives, that is most definitely a violent project. And violence often is imposed by those who are closest to you. So in a sense, it's a home project, you know.
Yeah.
I was lucky, I got off lucky. But even then, I say this in my book, I think the problem is that women, even middle-class women, even women from families like mine, which tend to give women a very long rope, you know, even there, we are essentially trained and prepared for dislocation all our lives. We are told you don't really belong here in this house. You must go somewhere else. You belong to a man, and therefore wherever that man is, you will go there. So in a sense, it's taken me very long to fight that conditioning myself, and for my family to accept that, you know, that maybe this is not the way to talk to this girl. But this, I think, is universal. Women basically are trained to accept dislocation, to not challenge it. And in a way, that is a bit of a dead end, because if you are not in control of where you can move, then you're not going to be in control of your life.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you flagged this idea of financial independence, because it evokes all kinds of reactions, and yet you realize it gives you a certain, I don't want to say agency, but you know, makes the rope a little bit longer, you know, in some ways for you. And also I have to say, you know, Annie, I'm really glad that you've acknowledged that the issue exists, globally, but also in some senses agnostic to privilege. So yes, it would be heightened in particular sort of cohorts more than others. And I'm completely, you know, I want to register that, but to say I can, and I think Sabyn's popped into the chat that she can relate to this completely. And I think so can I, you know, and I just feel like it's such a breath of fresh air to realize that someone's being honest enough to say, well, I'm not just talking about women occupying rural India or like some little slum in Pakistan, you know, and to say, yes, it's everywhere, but also despite the so-called education, independence, your road's been and probably continues to be long, you know, in many ways to even get the family to do that. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. Sabyn, welcome. You know, I waited to introduce you just till you were with us. I just want to tell everybody we have Sabyn Javeri with us. Sabyn is a senior lecturer of writing, literature, and creative writing at New York University, Abu Dhabi. She's also the author of Hijabistan and the novel Nobody Killed Her. And Sabyn's work has also appeared widely in numerous renowned publications like the London Magazine, like the Journal of Commonwealth Literature, Wasafri, the Exonian Review, amongst others. No worries at all, Sabyn, about being late. And Sabyn has an MSc from the University of Oxford and a PhD from the University of Leicester. And research-wise, she's interested in transcultural feminism, in South Asian literature, as well as ideas behind inclusive pedagogy and creative writing. And I hope today is an opportunity, Sabyn, for us to build on many of the conversations that we've been a part of in the past, which in some small or big way are trying to push the needle on making sense of feminist logics, especially outside of Western contexts, but maybe beyond as well. So Sabyn, I want to jump right in. And I'm going to say, you know, speaking to Myriam and Annie before you, I was really keen to anchor part of today's conversation about movement and about displacement to root some of that, you know, fairly abstract stuff in our own journeys and just in a way establish our own context, you know. So I guess where I want to start with is almost asking you to trace your footsteps, if that makes sense, kind of literally and metaphorically, symbolically as well. how did you get where you are right now? And what sort of movement and negotiation, kind of loss, attachment, everything, kind of even maybe new exploration that has come in the wake of that? In a sense, I'm saying trace your footsteps for us.
Thank you, Saba. First of all, apologies for being late. I was having some Zoom trouble, and also just to say that I have a very bad cold and cough. So if I erupt into sudden sneezes, please excuse me. I'm just fascinated hearing Annie's response. I apologize, I missed Myriam's because of the internet issues. So tracing my steps, I think I won't trace all the way because I think I don't want to use up valuable time from these, wonderful participants. I think maybe I could just respond or step in from where Annie left off, and I could absolutely relate to what she was talking about. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
My internet was freezing. What she was talking about in terms of financial independence, dislocation. And for me as well, writing was a way to express it. It was never meant to be a career. I don't think there was a career in the picture at all. I think everyone, including myself, was surprised that I could make a career out of it. I was also brought up I was brought up in a fairly conservative household, despite it being from a privileged class. And the idea was to aspire to marriage, and everything along the way, education, etc., contributed to the marriageability of women in the household or the culture that I was growing up in. And therefore, I was given a choice, and I thought I made the best of, the worst. And I married quite young. I had the opportunity to go abroad through marriage, and that's where I discovered public libraries. This was something I didn't have access to growing up in the 1980s in Karachi. There were very few public libraries, and even those that were there stocked extremely outdated so-called classics, which I had no interest in reading. So once in England, I started reading, and from there, my world expanded. I like to think that it gave me a sense of agency, empowerment, and somehow opportunity as well. I had the opportunity to once I had children and they were in school, I had the opportunity to get admission in a college and get myself an education, and that was completely fascinating for me because I had no qualifications. I don't even know how I got into a master's program without a bachelor's degree. And from there, my world opened up, and I really fought for my freedom. I was brought up being told that marriage was the key to liberation. It wasn't. I traveled quite a bit wherever my ex-husband would be, wherever he would go, I was just following. And then finally, through education, through books, I realized that, and through writing became not just a means of expression, but also a means of income. And therefore, I had the agency to walk away. And my last book, Hijabistan, is a metaphorical take on the whale. And I think one of the things I was trying to explore through that book was the things we hide, the whale as a metaphor, not necessarily as a physical garment, but as something, stories that we tell ourselves, stories that we hide from others, even from ourselves. And it was a way of coming to terms with walking out of an abusive marriage, and finding my own space, of finally moving somewhere where I wanted to. And that's why I could really relate to what Annie was saying, because the idea of dislocation is so embedded. I won't speak for everyone, but I know that for Pakistani Muslim women, the idea to choose the space where you want to live, it's something very unique, and it requires a lot of agency. The idea of breaking out of a marriage, it's something that is not very supportive. It's something that is completely taboo. You're told to just hide, just veil all the problems within it, because the idea of the family structure is so strongly embedded in the cultural values. And for me, it was a way, writing Hijabistan was a way of sort of deveiling or unveiling those core values, which can be very stifling, and that sense of agency that is very difficult to explore on your own, sometimes even with financial independence, because you lack that emotional independence. So so I hope I've traced a little bit of my recent journey.
Absolutely. And I really, really appreciate the sort of just the fact that, you're honest about it. And amongst everything you said, Sabyn, the fact that you're able to say, well, I don't know how I got into the program without the bachelor's. And I just think that's so important for anyone even listening in, right? Because we tend to hear these stories as much more extreme spectrums of like someone went from, and I was hoping that the conversation kind of goes down a route where we're placing vulnerability and candor kind of front and center. And I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Yeah, well, Myriam, yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead, Sabyn.
No, I was just saying thank you for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to share my story with such brilliant women.
Absolutely, yeah. Myriam, I want to come back to you, and I want to say that, in a lot of our, well, not forget about our work for a second, but even just in our trajectories, in our personal lives, this sense of place, whether physical or otherwise, works almost like often as a protagonist. It works almost like a character in our journeys. And especially, I would say, having gone through part of your work, especially in yours, as does nostalgia. And that's why I was like, that's definitely something I want to come back to when you flagged it in our earlier conversation. And now you've written a memoir about your experience as a child of the Ethiopian revolution, And I was hoping that you can talk to us a little bit about how both of those things and everything else that's part of it comes together, but sort of sense of place and movement and nostalgia when you think about your own journey, when you think about the memoir, and when you think about, the different facets of your identity.
So, it's funny because right now I'm just working on a book about my relation to my father, who was in prison many years. And it was, I just thought it was so funny because thinking about the conversation we were going to have about women and place, it led me to the opposite, in the sense, another side of the question, in the sense that for me in Ethiopia, when I came after in France, finally the issues I could have were not so much about the country, about the place, the culture. I could, I was moving from one culture to the other. I had the French culture to my mother, the Ethiopian culture from my father. But what I really felt was the problem of the omnipotence of my mother, on the narrative of regarding my father or regarding my other side.
Yeah.
And so I think my travel, my journey had a lot to do with the question of the omnipotence of a narrative among the other.
Yeah.
And trying to find the balance, because at the end of it, it's always the question of power. Who is the master? And who is taking control on a language? Because even when you speak a language, now I mainly speak French, but what happens with this other language you have in you that is kept silent? And who is keeping it silent, by the way? What are the inner boundaries you're putting on yourself? Because when I was listening to both of you, you know, I noticed how much it was so much about this, what is imposed to us. And this question of what is imposed to us is a human question. You know, we all have to do with it, because through education, wherever we have, after it's a question of degrees, I would say, of violence and degrees of how it embodies in physical, material issues about money, education, etc. But after all, at the end of the day, it's always what am I doing with my inner boundaries? And so this is the long journey for me, I think.
Sure.
You know, to first of all, to acknowledge them and not take them like a kind of identify to you, because the main question is, to what do I identify myself? Do I identify to a country, to a culture, to a gender, to a social class? Who am I in this? Am I this? Or this is part of my history. This is part, of my story, but this is not who I am. So, and for me, it was very interesting that I discovered, for example, myself of being, Ethiopian when I came in France. Of course, I didn't give a lot of importance to it. I was just seeing myself as just a human being, and especially that the place where I grew up in Addis Ababa was, I was attending a lycée where you had people from everywhere. So, what was the point? And then I discovered myself. I was always questioned in France on the problem was not that I was coming from Ethiopia. The problem was that, in the field of theater, when I started my career as an actress, is that I didn't look like what I was supposed to look as an Ethiopian. So then you start to deal with fantasies, with something that has nothing to do with reality. And nobody knows about this reality, in fact. And so it was, for me, it was very challenging, but also very interesting, because it forced me to question my reality, and who was totally, just, how could I say, I'm looking for the word, kind of trapped, or toned out from one interpretation, one vision from another. And I didn't know if I wanted to fix in the box, by the way.
Yeah,
You know?
100%.
And so at the end, this is why I just, at a moment of my life, renounced to the theater field as an actress, because I was tired of trying to get in the box when I finally didn't want to. And this is where I really decided to get more, to explore and to get more serious about writing. I always wrote, but then I really decided to dedicate my life to write, because there I was free.
Yeah, yeah.
No one was there except my own demons, you know, to tell me what I was supposed to say, or to how I was supposed to look or not look, etc. You know, and this is, it was for me the place of freedom, and this is where also I discovered all my prisons.
Sure.
And so this is what I'm exploring mainly now. It's you know, trying to be aware, because it's a question of conscience. In fact, conscience, freedom is conscience. It's nothing else. And being aware of the story you're telling to yourself. And you can change your life and you can change your past by changing the perspective, by changing the narrative. Because in fact, we are stuck in our narratives.
Yeah, yeah. You know, Myriam, I'm so glad you answered that, because I was very curious when I read that you are now sort of writing is like bread and butter in some ways, you know, and I find that fascinating. And also Sabyn touched upon, you know, this idea of the writer identity in some ways, right? And what that offered her, similar to yourself, I suppose. And I was on this with female writers, I hate to label it like that, but it was an all women's writing workshop with, it was an all Emirati women's writing workshop. And I was doing a couple of sessions there in December. And one thing that so many of them sort of flagged was exactly this idea of this feeling of this imposter syndrome of we're somewhere we're not expected, meant, supposed to be. You know, and I guess we bump up against that in so many different contexts. Writing, perhaps one of them, theater, perhaps obviously for you, one of them, but it seems like there's a pattern there, and it's definitely something that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, please, Sabyn.
Or the opposite as well, you know, this sense that you do belong somewhere and that you're meant to be in that space. But, you know, the way Myriam said, you know, you end up questioning your own reality because you're not conforming to that stereotype or that image. And then at some point you hit this wall where instead of questioning the reality around you and why it is so deluded and not accepting the way that you see yourself, that doubt, not necessarily imposter syndrome, but the opposite of it, you know, that dissatisfaction that this is who I am, but why am I not being accepted as the person that I am with the narrative that I want to create? Why is the story being imposed on me? And that clash between the story that we tell ourselves, or the story inside us, and the story that is being told about us. So I just thought that was very interesting, the imposter syndrome, and that sort of, I wonder if there's even a name for it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks. And I was hoping, Sabyn, that you and Annie would jump in, because that's exactly kind of how we wanted to have the conversation. Annie, I'm going to come to your documentary, which I touched upon briefly. So Annie's done this documentary, which is called, in her words, The Journey of Indian Women. And I've just been blown away by it. I want to come back to it. I want to bring our students to it, but also just personally, I think I really want, there is so much to unpack there. And I mean, I don't know what to leave out and what to include, but right, Annie, from the songs that these women are singing, and I think that's the first thing. So, Sabyn and Myriam, her documentary starts with, like, you can hear it before you see it, in a sense. And that the fact that remains almost throughout, again, I feel like it's working like some sort of character almost. And there are these women who are singing, and then someone later on in the documentary goes on to explain that when these women are cutting paddy, they're singing this, and it almost signals this kind of angst that they've, kind of held within them, they've repressed within them. And this is their way of rooting. And so they create these verses as they work. And to me, what really stood out was this idea of the everyday in that, something that may seem banal, but is in fact perhaps resistance, perhaps not labeled as that by them. I have no idea. But, the fact that there is something in this idea of everyday contention that seems to be buried there. And I was just really curious and keen for you to talk to us about, how you came to this film, or the film came to you, and why is this significant for you, and kind of what's the backstory to it, in a sense, I suppose.
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been sort of interested in film, but I wasn't trained in film, and I had actually edited a book before this, and the book is called Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing. I was commissioned to actually do it. I have to confess that despite identifying as feminist and all that, I wasn't that into the idea of quote unquote women's literature. It felt a bit boxy to me. So I was resisting it myself in my own work, and I didn't particularly feel like reading it either. I had read before that a kind of 2-volume set, which is kind of path-breaking work by Susie Tharu and Kayla Leta, which does the work of documenting Indian women's literature. I didn't necessarily identify with the notion of a women's literature until then. And so, Sabyn says she teaches that book. Thank you. I actually, I learned a lot from that volume, and I still wasn't sure, one, whether I was even qualified to do it, because I'm not an academic. I'm not even, my training's in journalism. It's not even in literature. But then Aleph approached me and said, publisher David Davidar, he said, do you want to do this? And I was like, one, I'm not sure why you're asking me. Two, I'm not so sure. And he said that we're not looking at an academic approach to the subject. We are looking at a literary selection, and we're looking at somebody like you to come in with your sensibility and your approach to putting such a book together. So I said, okay, I'll do it. Instead of just doing, I think a lot of anthologists tend to do that, which I don't necessarily, I didn't want to do it, which is to just look at the best of, and to look at other anthologies and kind of cobbling together an anthology based on that. I set myself this goal that I will read everything I can find from all Indian languages, provided it's available in translation. And from there, I will make my own selections. So I started naturally with the Susie Tharu collection, but because that is, I mean, in fact, I don't think that similar work has been undertaken since then, and that was done in the 1990s. Also, they made a conscious decision to leave out people writing in English, and that was, you know, in today's time, that is just because so many people across India, and I mean, I was only focused on India, but all over the world, women are now writing in English as a first language. So when I did that book, something in me changed. I found, one, myself identifying much more strongly with women's literature than I did before. I also learned to look at the category of women's literature in a different way. It isn't a box. It just is, it's like this ocean, you know, but you treat it like a box. And it opened out my own mental biases. It revealed my own biases to myself, firstly. Secondly, it also taught me that women do comment on everything, but they comment from a, if not feminist, at least a feminine perspective, and that this perspective is valuable, and it is framed by their experiences, their fears, their particular way of looking at the world. It also taught me to think about what purpose literature serves in society. What does it mean? Indian literature, South Asian literature, literature. I mean, you know, when you attach to that identity is something, a way of looking at yourself. A society's way of looking at itself. And when you consider that women were completely left out of education, consciously forced out of education actually for so long, then the story that our culture is telling about ourselves is really a story that seeks to actively, not just passively, but actively forces women's experiences and views completely out of the equation. So when I did the book, I had that awareness. I wasn't sure everybody was going to read that book, you know, especially, I mean, my commentary, whatever it is about it. A film is in some ways, in a very short time, in less than an hour, you can try and put some of those ideas across in a more direct way. So I decided to apply for a grant, and luckily I got it. And I then went about making the film. I used a lot of my own research, which came from doing the book. And then I went out and looked for those people, those women writers, translators, publishers, talked to them. And they opened up more doors for me in terms of, you know, just thinking about women's literature, what even qualifies as literature, you know, when we discuss literature, what is literature, what isn't literature, all of that. And this is the thing. In the film, you will see there's this one woman who's singing. She's not singing of the particular. The song is from a different region, and the commentary is about another region. But the song says it's a folk song. It's not a song which is published anywhere. I think, as far as I know, it's not. But in the song, it's written in a feminine voice, and she's saying that my body is just breaking with the amount of work that I do, and that before the cock crows, I have to wake up, you know, and then do this, and then do that, and then do that. And the whole song is just this, goes on about the amount of work that she does. And I think that you need to hear it in a woman's voice, and you need to just know the amount of work that women do in this world, which sometimes, even if it's acknowledged, you know, it's not enough to say that women do so much work, you should respect them. No, you shouldn't just respect them, you should give them their share of the work. So I mean, that's a very long answer to your question, but that's one reason I made the film.
I'm really glad you shared that, because I was specifically going to say to Sabyn and Myriam, but also just to anyone listening in and beyond, that it is really evocative. It's so powerful, and it's something that stays with you and you want to come back to. So I would really encourage everyone to kind of watch it. You know, in the interest of time, because I know that we're going to have to wrap soon, I'm going to weave in parts of Annie's film to conclude. And Sabyn, maybe start off with you, and if we have time, you know, maybe move to Myriam and come back to Annie. But you know, I want to start with Sabyn. And I suppose now I'm saying I always struggle with framing these looking ahead kind of questions, because what I'm not asking you to do is kind of give some big macro predictions about women movement and things like that. But let me set you the context a little bit, Sabyn. I'm springing off Annie's work here, but also beyond, and kind of trying to think about technology. So, we're obviously in a world where it's a technology-ridden world, which is a bit of a double-edged sword when it comes to women, agency, patriarchy, what you will. But we are also, as Annie's film tells us, and I found this so powerful, in a world where Dalit women are writing, where women who we don't necessarily label as writers, are writing. People who might not be seen through the prism of the writer are writing. And then again, using off Annie's film here, we're in a world where people get really worried about women reading and writing what can be seen as the wrong kind of literature. Not that such a thing exists, but it's there, right? And I can certainly relate to this. I remember last year I was in Karachi for these book events, and Liberty Books, which is one of like the leading bookstores there, they gave me a bag at the end of the book launch, and it said "Dangerous Women Read." And it's something I treasure, but I also realize it can induce a kind of, sorry, Sabyn.
True.
Yeah, and it can induce a kind of moral panic and can be seen as kind of threatening when a threat when women read and write about a certain kind of literature that can be seen as wrong. And I suppose what I realize is that when we do see women reading and writing about this wrong kind of literature, which I use so strangely, it gives you a certain kind of, at least for me, it gives me a certain kind of admiration and respect. And there's something I want to imbibe there, because this is somebody who's actually raising their hand and saying, this is who I am, this is what my experiences are, this is what my body is. And you also, as a consumer of that, realize someone's been there before me. And I think that can be really powerful. And a lot of this is kind of woven into Annie's work as well, and into the film she's made. So, I want to wrap up, Sabyn, by asking you what you envision, I suppose, in the everyday, and like we were saying, the seemingly ordinary. That's something that really interests me. What you envision, also what you hope for, I suppose, when it comes to speaking about experiencing kind of movement, and obviously accompanying displacement, but also kind of stringing us back to what literature might bring to the table, which is not easy, but maybe I'll ask you to help us wrap up there, and maybe we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I think you put that really beautifully, Saba. So I would just say I'm slightly uncomfortable with the words movement, or because I feel that, or even as Annie put it, the idea of literature or women's writing, because I feel we've always been telling stories. Our grandmothers, or people, women who did not have the privilege of learning to read or write, may have not had the ability to express themselves in words, but they were always showcasing agency, protest, resilience in some form or the other. And to try and box that in some sort of movement or ideology, I think that's very restricting, and in some sense reminiscent of what Myriam was talking about, being boxed in. My grandmother had this fear of books, and she would tell me, don't read, it's bad for you, you'll get glasses, which I did, and no one will marry you. But she was, she would not have identified as a feminist, but she was a feminist in and out. I mean, you mess with her and she would put so many chilies in the food that everybody would go hungry. So, she had that power, she had that agency. And same with my mother, she loved writing poetry. It wasn't approved because Urdu poetry, women writing Urdu poetry has always had a sort of, romantic poetry has had a sort of, associations with courtesans, and therefore she would write it, in secret. But, her form of, she sang, and, as Annie said, singing was her way of, telling a story, raising her voice. So nowadays, we have writing, we have social media. Everyone is telling a story on social media. Many women find ways to express themselves through an anonymous identity online. Of course, there are repercussions, as we saw with Kandil Baloch. So, there's still a lot of silencing going on through trolling, even though technology may give women, a larger voice, a larger platform. But I think it's always been there, it's all about perspective. It's all about how we see it, how we see those voices, how we see that literature, and how we try and look at it in a more wholesome way, that, that literature is not constricted or restricted to words which have been written. It's all about voices, and those stories exist and will continue to exist with or without any ideology. So I know we're short on time, so I'll just stop there.
Yeah, no, but Sabyn, 100%. And, I think this a lot as well, like even in the Pakistani context, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, there is often this sense when we think about feminism there, which I kind of was guilty of myself, to think it's kind of the brainchild of modernity, which is also another term which makes no sense really, but you probably get where I'm coming from, this idea of like technology and social media. It's the most visible form of protest. And it took me a while to come to this realization that also in like formal corridors of literature and narrative making, there's a lot of work that has been done, be that in Urdu or English. I'm more familiar with Urdu, I suppose, from that time. But also what you put very poetically about generations before us in our familial zones, and of course beyond. And I was reading part of Rafia Zakaria's book Against White Feminism, and I'm not through all of it, but there was this little excerpt where she captures exactly what you've said, Sabyn, where she's like, she talks about mothers and grandmothers and kind of our predecessors, and says, they did X, Y, Z, whatever else they did, but they always showed up. And it's just that she says that in the arithmetic of Western feminism, it's always rebellion rather than resilience that gets registered and applauded. And I'm not sure where that sits with me, but all of this to say that I'm just so glad that, you've highlighted the fact that those stories are within sort of our surroundings, but also go way beyond the digitization of the world, and that makes it a lot more visible, but it's not to say they didn't exist. Myriam, Annie, I don't know if you want to add any last things. I know we're running short on time, but there any final thoughts? More than happy to take those.
Well, I totally relate and love what Sabyn and makes me think about, well, it's about expression and creating and not being bound and fixed to a form, in fact, and the question also of recognition. It's about recognizing, that life anyway finds a way to go through, and just it's up to us to catch it. I mean, and to recognize it. And perhaps the issues, the biggest problem that we can face is our non-recognition of us, of who we are. I think that's it.
Yeah. Annie, anything you'd like to add? And I hate putting these kinds of conversations on a timer, but I'd love to hear anything you have to say.
No, no kind of great final thoughts, just that.
I know that's a lot of pressure, like famous last words.
I guess just that I think one just has to recognize the role of and the power of visibility and of telling stories, of telling it, of saying it. I think whether, I haven't read that book yet, but it's an interesting juxtaposition of rebellion versus resilience. One can fall on either side or do both at the same time. But I do think that if one is to hope for anything better, something different, something which is not oppressive, something which is more inclusive and just more human for women, I think it is important. The first step and the continuous process also is to keep telling the story, to keep the conversation going, to not stop saying whatever your truth is. And because without that, then where are we? What are we going to do without that? So that's all.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. This has been an absolute privilege. And, I'm sure all of us are taking away a lot from it, but genuinely thank you for the honesty, kind of the embracing of vulnerability, and just for your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And,
Thank
thank you to Ananke for organizing this. And they've got a website that is launching for the Women in Literature Festival and beyond. It's launching this week. I think it's available tomorrow onwards. I would urge you to check it out through their website. But Sabyn, Annie, Myriam, thank you so much.
Thank you, Saba. It was really a beautiful conversation. Thank you, everyone. Really, really enjoyed it.
Bye.